the original energizing motor that makes me compose is the urge to communicate, and to communicate with as many people as possible. Because what I love about the world and about life is people. I like them as much as I like music, if not more. I love people. And I have a compulsion to share with people what I feel, what I know, and what I think.
In the vocabulary of our age, the name Leonard Bernstein means music. Composer, conductor, pianist, teacher, author. His talents and activities have extraordinary range. As a composer, he is equally at home in the concert hall or on Broadway. He has written symphonies, choral works, music for films, ballets, opera, and theater.
42. 3.
His commitment to music is total. His desire to communicate has brought the joy of music to millions of people. From podium to piano, typewriter to television studio, his energies are in constant motion.
Marvelous rehearsal. That I really enjoyed, and we really played beautifully now. Thank you. That's already a rehearsal.
It was in New York City at Carnegie Hall on November 14, 1943, that Leonard Bernstein burst onto the music scene. At the age of 25, he had just been appointed assistant conductor of the New York Philharmonic.
The point of that job was to be always ready to jump in case a conductor, a real conductor of the Philharmonic, that is, Rajinsky, or a guest conductor, got ill. But within the memory of anybody at the Philharmonic, no conductor had ever gotten sick. And all the assistant conductors here had just sat, growing increasingly bitter, frustrated, knowing all the scores, being always ready, having their tailcoat hanging in the locker backstage, ready to come on a moment's notice, and never getting the opportunity to do so. And I had not been in this job 2 months. It was November 14th, 1943. I will never forget. That Sunday morning at 9 o'clock, the phone rang, and it was Bruno Zerato on the other end saying, well, this is it. You have to conduct at 3 o'clock this afternoon. No chance for a rehearsal, nothing. Bruno Walter is ill, he has the flu, there's no way to get the orchestra together, and you will report at 2:45 backstage at Carnegie Hall and conduct the concert this afternoon. So there I am standing in the wings, all a tremble, listening to Bruno Zerato, who had come out on stage, address the audience and tell them the unhappy news that they would not be hearing Bruno Walter that day, many groans, but instead would be hearing a young conductor called Leonard Bernstein. And that's the last thing I remember until the end of the concert when I saw the entire audience there standing and cheering and screaming. But between the time of my entrance and the time of my last exit, I remember nothing. The next thing I remember is my mother and father. And my mother and father walking into the dressing room. And my father all aglow. It was the first time in his life. And baffled. He couldn't understand what had happened. Because he had been so against my being a musician all those years. Where will it lead you? To playing in a hotel lobby for the rest of your life with palm trees and playing Cole Porter songs. You see, his tradition was that a musician in the Russian Jewish ghetto, where he came from, after all, till he was 16 he lived in such a ghetto. A musician was among the lowest orders of being. A musician was a strolling player who went from wedding to wedding, or funerals, or bar mitzvahs, or whatever, playing his violin or whatever he played, and was thrown a kopeck now and then, or given a bowl of soup to eat. But he was little better than a beggar.
Watch for it.
It was a very low order of humankind. And it was very hard for him to adjust to the fact that there was such a thing as a musical world in which one could succeed.
And they cut off, and he says, I want to pray. Now short.
I didn't even know as a child, I think till I was 14, that there were such things as concerts that one could go to. That there was such a thing as a musical life. That there were musicians, there was a community of musicians, that there were music lovers, that there were people who took it all very seriously. I had no background at all in music from my family. And here was my father standing there absolutely dazzled, bewildered, stupefied, because he had seen, how many thousands of people does this place hold, on their feet, screaming and cheering for his little Lenny, who had been standing there conducting all afternoon. And he suddenly realized that it was all possible. And there was a great moment of forgiveness and very deep emotion.
Leonard Bernstein was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1918. His parents were immigrants from Russia. His father hoped his son would join the family business. He said years later, "How was I to know he would grow up to be Leonard Bernstein?" After the historic debut at Carnegie Hall, Leonard Bernstein's rise to fame was nothing short of phenomenal. He became an instant celebrity. Fame brought almost limitless opportunities for his creative energies.
A curious corollary occurs to me sitting here in Carnegie Hall. That is a corollary to the event, the great event that took place here in 1943. And that is that it was not just a concert for the 2,000 odd people in this hall, but it was a radio broadcast. And I've said this before, but it occurs to me in an interesting new light because it was kind of prophetic that my debut as a conductor should have been involved with electronic medium, the medium of radio, because that was to play in its various other manifestations such a great part in the rest of my life since that day. But it wasn't really until 1954, when I got involved with television, that I realized what the tremendous power of the media can be in terms of music.
Leonard Bernstein was an immediate success on television. His special combination of intelligence and wit ensured his reputation as music's most articulate spokesman.
Well, you see, they don't need me. They do perfectly well by themselves. So why is a conductor necessary, after all?
But what I realized about it was not only could I share what I thought and felt about these matters, about Beethoven and about the creative process itself with millions of people, face to face, eye to eye, nose to nose, but that I could also use visual aids, which was a whole new wrinkle. For example, we had the first page of the Beethoven Fifth, the whole score, painted in white on a black floor. And we had musicians standing, each one on the designated line. There was a viola player on the viola line, a clarinet player on the clarinet, and so on. And then I dismissed the ones that Beethoven had dismissed in his own mind, because he begins the Fifth Symphony only with strings and clarinets. So out went flutes, oboes, horns, trumpets, and leaving only the people who were relevant standing there. And this made such an impression on people because it had this visual connotation and corroboration of what I was saying, which they were receiving in an auditory way. I realized suddenly that my old teaching instinct, which I had inherited from my father and from all my teachers, I guess, who taught me how to teach, this old quasi-rabbinical instinct that I have for teaching and explaining and verbalizing, suddenly found a real paradise in the whole electronic world of television.
The innovative Omnibus broadcasts of the mid-1950s were followed by the Young People's Concerts, popular nationwide programs that Bernstein conducted for more than a decade. No other television programming so enriched the musical lives of young Americans.
And when I came to take the New York Philharmonic in 1958, a few years later, one of the conditions I made was that the Young People's Concerts, which were a regular feature of the Philharmonic's subscription, should be televised.
Bernstein's own education brought him into contact with some of the greatest musicians of his day. At Harvard University, he studied composition with Walter Piston and Edward Burlingame Hill. After graduating, he went to New York City to pursue a career as a musician. But his first 3 months of job hunting were a disappointment.
And here I was, 21, and a graduate of Harvard, and couldn't find a job. That was a big sense of defeat. I felt like an utter failure. It was a rather lean period in my life.
Within that year, however, Bernstein would encounter 3 men who would set his professional course. The Greek conductor Dimitri Mitropoulos was in New York that summer, and Bernstein sought his advice.
I went to the Biltmore and called up Mitropoulos, and there he was. "What shall I do?" I said to Dimitri. Dimitri said, "I know what you should do. You must be a conductor." And I said, "Conductor? Me? A conductor?" I mean, for me, a conductor was a tiny little figure that I would see from the second balcony of Symphony Hall during all those years of my teens. A barely discernible little figure seen from very far away, who was so glamorous and so inaccessible and special, conducting 100-odd men, that it never occurred to me that I could be such a thing. Well, he said I should be such a thing. And I said, fine, well, how does one become one? He said, you study.
Fritz Reiner, the formidable conducting master of the Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, agreed to audition Bernstein.
And there was this very gruff, tough man called Fritz Reiner, who sort of grunted and said, he took a big score and put it on the piano, opened it to the middle, wouldn't let me see the title, and said, "Can you play that on the piano?" And I said I could try, and I did. And it turned out to be the Academic Festival Overture of Brahms, which I didn't even know at the time, but I played it anyway. I was a good sight reader. That was a big forte at the time. And he was quite impressed that I could play all that. And in short, I was admitted to his class. In the spring of '40, I read in the papers that Serge Koussevitzky, the conductor of the Boston Symphony, announced that he was forming a school called Tanglewood in the Berkshires. and that he would be teaching conducting himself.
Armed with letters of recommendation from Mitropoulos and Reiner, Bernstein went to Tanglewood.
And so there I was, sitting in the presence of the great Koussevitzky, trembling and white. And suddenly Koussevitzky said, but of course I will take you in my class. It was just like that, great shock, and a wonderful shock. And so that summer, I studied with him at Tanglewood. We became instant friends, almost a father-son relationship. His method of teaching was rather more in terms of emotions, and it must be warm like the sun come up in the morning, and the crescendo must be, you know. Whereas Reiner would say, what is the second clarinet playing at this moment? He'd stop you. And you'd think, is there a second clarinet? I really don't know. Do you mean transposed, or the way it is in the score? And you'd freeze up. It was a scary way of teaching, and Koussy's way was the opposite of scary. It was inviting and warm and embracing and very beautiful.
Through the following summers, Bernstein became Koussevitzky's assistant and protege. At last, the idea of being a conductor seemed almost possible.
You have to understand that in those days, in 1943, a 25-year-old conductor was an unheard of phenomenon. I mean, no one ever conducted an orchestra unless he was in his 40s. And then he was considered very young. As a matter of fact, when Mitropoulos made his debut in this country, he was in his mid-40s, and he was considered a very young conductor. But 25 was out of the question, besides which, an American conductor of 25, well, that's two strikes against you. Nobody ever heard of an American conductor except Howard Barlow, who conducted the Columbia Broadcasting System Orchestra, and who sometimes guest conducted the New York Philharmonic because it was like a token gesture toward American artists, but very token. And besides which, strike three was being an American 25-year-old conductor with the name of Leonard Bernstein, an unheard of, impossible name for a conductor. Koussevitzky had, in fact, I think in 42 or 3, begged me to change it. He invited me to dinner at his house and said, Lenushka, I have something of the most grave to discuss with you. This was during the war. And he began to explain to me the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which I knew about very well, having been beaten up by the Irish kids when I was a kid going to school in Boston. I knew about all that. He said, you know, it is very difficult in this world for a Jewish boy. And Leonard Bernstein, it will never be on Carnegie Hall, the poster Leonard Bernstein. And in fact, he had my new name all picked out for me. It was to be Leonard S. Burns, if you can imagine such a thing. I tossed and turned and thought about it, and I reported to him the next morning, no soap, I'm sorry. I will have to make it with the name Leonard Bernstein or not at all.
The years that followed were filled with conducting, teaching, world premieres, and Broadway openings. Bernstein married the actress Felicia Montealegre and began to raise a family. Eventually, Leonard Bernstein would assume the highest post of any American-born and trained musician, music director of the New York Philharmonic. He took the orchestra on world tours to Europe, the Near and Far East, Latin America, and the Soviet Union. Bernstein became America's foremost musical ambassador. One of the countries most frequently visited by Bernstein is Israel, whose orchestra he first conducted in 1947. To celebrate their 30-year association, the Israel Philharmonic has organized a nationwide Leonard Bernstein Festival. It is the first retrospective of his work as a composer.
The honor is my honor. I am so privileged to be having this retrospective. It's really the first time that's ever happened. And I'm a little embarrassed by it because I don't feel old enough to have a retrospective. I don't feel I've done enough in my life. I admit I've done a lot of things, but I don't feel that I've come to that point where one should take a great backward look from the beginning to the present and make assessments and judgments. And I'm terribly, deeply honored and profoundly touched to have it done by this orchestra, which I love like my family. Everyone in this orchestra is so dear to me, so it makes it a kind of special concert for me.
The orchestra has invited guest conductors and soloists from all over the world.
The beginning, you remember from 13 years ago.
Selections have been made from the broad range of Bernstein's music. The film score from On the Waterfront, Broadway hits from West Side Story, Candide, On the Town, and Wonderful Town. The Serenade for Violin and String Orchestra, the symphonies, Jeremiah and Age of Anxiety. But the centerpiece of the festival is Bernstein's Third Symphony, Kaddish, dedicated to the memory of John F. Kennedy. The work had its world premiere with the Israel Philharmonic in 1964.
I want to say Kaddish. I don't have a feeling of authority, really, in the sense that I am telling everybody what to do, but I am coaxing or playing it with them in a way. It's very hard to describe. Breathing with them, pulsing with them, suggesting. And if I could play the oboe and the tuba and the bassoon, I mean, I would be playing all those parts. If I had 70 mouths and 50 arms.
Go on. K, please. Not bad, not bad.
When one is a public person, as we said before back at Carnegie Hall, one is extrovertive, gregarious. One is constantly in company, dealing with colleagues and friends and associates and managers and so on. When one is in the private composing life, one is alone. But there is something about that kind of loneliness that is not lonely at all, and that is much more gregarious in a funny way than the public life. It works in just the opposite way, and the reason is that if one is a thinking person as opposed to a performing person, or a thoughtless person, an unthinking person, one is in the company of those thoughts constantly. One is never so active as when one is doing nothing. And one is never less alone, numquam minus solum esse, than when one is alone. Think about that for a second. Because when one is alone, that's when all one's thoughts, feelings, whatever is kept down in one's societal life and activity rise to the surface. And one is besieged. Now, I know in my most solitary periods, when I was working on Kaddish at the McDowell colony, for example, one is completely alone at the McDowell colony. Or when I was working on Mass at the McDowell colony also. I was absolutely besieged by these ghosts and characters, as though I were writing plays and the characters had come to life and were all around me. And they won't let you alone. And they never leave you alone, even in your sleep. You are never alone. In fact, you are much more alone among people. A reasoning, thinking man is, and a creative artist is, much more alone among people than he is by himself. And he is much more active by himself than he is in action.
Brother top, everybody. Soprani.
Composer and conductor, Bernstein prepares Kaddish for performance at the Israel Festival. Religious, theatrical, and deeply personal, the symphony is a complex work for full orchestra and 3 separate choirs.
Hold it. You already have some fortepianos, don't you, tenors? Didn't we discuss these basses? Brim, bum, bim, bum, bum. And then fortepiano. All right. Right on it. 1. I love the faces. So beautiful. But I can't hear you. I love the way you look. But the way you sound. Let me hear it. Let me hear when you come in. Even if you sing the right notes, it's no good. There's nothing. It's a it has to dance. All right. It should be clear, like the sun comes out. You know?
One does one's best work as a composer lying down, and presumably asleep, to all appearances anyway. And one, if one is lucky, hits that exact trance-like state between consciousness and unconsciousness, which is the ideal state in which ideas rise from that bottomless pit. Suddenly you have an idea, you have a concept. The trick is then to wake yourself up enough to write it down and not forget it. It's a matter of seconds. And in the course of the transition between the semi-waking and the waking state, you can forget the whole thing. As a matter of fact, the ideal state is having no idea of time during that compositional process. You suddenly look at your watch and 4 hours have gone by and you've just been writing. You don't know what's happened to those hours. You don't know what's happened to the outside world or to your family or to anything. And so when I sit here for long nights all by myself and don't have a thought in my head and think, oh, well, I just have nothing to write. I'm dry, I'm blocked, I'm going through a writer's dry spell of some sort. I can sit at the piano and just improvise, just strum some chords or try a sequence of notes. And I don't like them particularly, but I keep doing it, and then suddenly I will find one that hits that suggests something else. Because you see, the whole point of composing, as I said before, componere, putting together, is not to find one chord that you love. Say, oh, that's terrific, I must write it down. That means nothing. One note means nothing. It means something only as it progresses to another note. And then you suddenly have a meaning. It's the same with a chord or with a counterpoint. It means nothing unless it's in context with something else. And so when you find that, and how can I describe that process? It's, if you think of the mind, not the brain, I'm not speaking of the brain, but the mind, where creativity takes place, as an immensely complicated circuitry of electronic threads, all of which are connected at certain points. And they are all informational. But every once in a while, there's something like a short circuit, but two of them will cross. Two informational threads, strands, will cross, touch, and set off something called an idea. And suddenly, something is born. And every time it happens, I am filled with gratitude. That's what I say, gratias agibus tibi. I'm very grateful for that gift and for those moments. Just as I can be terribly depressed by the moments in between when nothing happens. But I always know that eventually it will happen. Eventually, those two strands will come together, a spark will fly, and I'll be off sailing. My ego gone, I won't know my name, I won't know what time it is, and then I'm a composer.
All right, it's the first time the kids have had a chance to do it here with us, so let's do it again from the beginning. It's one bar before you come in, piano, soprano, right? Pam, pim, pam. J, let's go. And. Not ready. There are two things you can do. In one case, take a breath. If you have to take a breath, take one. Even if it's wrong, take one.
Yeah.
And the other is don't try for such a pianissimo.
In other words, I'm not crescendoing, and so that's why
Then
you
I
should
won't.
do the tempo
I won't have
thing.
to expand it
Yeah,
so
I
much.
see. All right.
It's better to have a louder note than no note. You know what I mean? I have certain labels that are attached to me, and I'm used to them by now. The fact that most of my music is tonal is responsible for one of the labels, which is conservative or old-fashioned or whatever it is. This, of course, does not take into account the fact that I play a great deal of music that is not tonal, and which I like very much. But this
somehow doesn't seem to affect the general attitude toward me, which is that I am conservative and retrogressive, or whatever you want to call it. And that is largely because I believe in tonality. And this is not a conscious belief, it's not a conscious decision to preempt a belief. It is inbuilt, and it's something I simply believe in. It is something that is at the heart of what I do as a composer. And this is not to say that I have not written non-tonal music, because I have. And perhaps the most striking example of that is Kaddish, my third symphony, which contains a great deal of highly complex, carefully worked out, according to the Schoenbergian system, 12-tone music. It's obvious to me now that at that point, the tremendous agony of the dialogue with God, which occupies the main portion of Kaddish, had to be expressed in the expressionistic manner.
Got there a little too late. You have 6 there? That's why you got too late, yeah. He has only 5. You always have different ones. It has to be very nervous, but it's always arrive together, all right? Slight nervous breakdown.
One of the main points of the piece is that the agony expressed by the 12-tone music has to give way, this is part of the form of the piece, to tonality and diatonicism even, so that what triumphs in the end, the affirmation of faith, is tonal.
All right, 1 before Y, please. Now let's see if we can do this without a stop. If we can, then we're already somewhere.
Letter. I suppose in my music, if I had to be critical about it, to the extent that I have any perspective about it at all, because most artists only pretend to have perspective about their pieces, their works. In the case of my own music, I would have to say that it has its roots everywhere. In jazz, in Hebrew liturgical music, in Bach and Beethoven, and Schumann and Chopin and Mahler and the rest. In the musicians of my own country, like Copland and Harris and Schumann. It also has its roots in Schoenberg and in the various movements that have revolutionized music in our century and caused crisis to occur in our musical history.
As the Charles Eliot Norton Professor of Poetry at Harvard in 1973, Bernstein delivered a series of lectures which examined the crisis in music caused by the break with tonality. In 6 televised talks, he propounded an inborn physical rationale for tonality based on a highly original analogy between music and spoken language. The music of the future, he suggested, would be a synthesis of divergent styles within a tonal framework.
The artist in America is in a particularly eclectic position, much more than Bach, Beethoven, the others that I mentioned, because he signifies and stands for a highly eclectic and pluralistic country. After all, there is no such thing as an American. Americans, if you want to go down to roots, are Red Indians. And with the exception of them, everyone else is an immigrant. We are all immigrants or sons or grandsons or great-great-grandsons of immigrants. And these immigrants are of all kinds. Some were slaves when they came here, and we tend to forget that when we speak of Americans as types. Some were Poles, and some were Hungarians, and some were Chinese, and some were Jews, and some were Spanish, and many, of course, now are Latin Americans. But they're all Americans. And anybody who has his ear to the ground and who is sensitive to the country in which he lives reflects that country. And being such a hodgepodge and such a pluralistic kind of country, it would naturally cause a reflection to take place, which is in itself eclectic. What holds it all together with any given particular composer is his own personal voice, which is always there. It renders the word eclectic a beautiful word.
Bernstein's eclecticism is evident in his Mass, a theater piece for singers, dancers, and players, which opened the John F. Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts in Washington, D.C. in 1971. A work which mixes Roman liturgy and rock lyrics, Mass was greeted with both praise and scorn.
I'm used to a great deal of critical hailstones. And by this time, at the ripe old age of whatever I am, it shouldn't bother me anymore, and I suppose it doesn't. On the other hand, it would be pleasant if people understood what it was I was trying to do. Now, when I say people, I'm making a very definite distinction between critics and people, because I write my music for people, and certainly not for critics. It's been said of my music that everything I have written is really music for the theater, and I think that's true in some way. I love words, I think, as much as notes. The natural expression of that love for words and music together should have been, I suppose, a great flood of songs all through my life. But I have not really been a song composer in the sense that Schubert was. I've always written songs in a theater context.
Indiana University's School of Music Opera Theater has sent a troupe of 25 young singers and musicians to Israel for the Bernstein Festival. They perform a review of Bernstein's Broadway theater songs and his one-act opera, Trouble in Tahiti.
I mean, it's so infectious what you do, and the talent comes through. And there's some good tunes, I admit. Why are you crying? You'll get back to Indiana and everything will be all right.
No, I keep telling him I was supposed to be in North Carolina on a farm. I'm not supposed to be over here with Leonard Bernstein.
See, opera doesn't sound very well in the American language. And I have always been of the opinion that we would develop a native opera of our own, something very special, unique to us, and that it would grow out of the Broadway musical. And that's why all my life, practically, I've been associated in one way or another with Broadway musicals. I have decided, at long last, to stop experimenting with the Broadway musical and to try, finally, to work in the opera house. And my next works are all going to be operas. If I'm lucky, I will come out with an American language set to a kind of music that is condign to it, that fits it, and that doesn't sound strained, phony, laughably operatic, but sounds natural. And if I'm not lucky, I will have failed, but I'm willing to take that chance. That also takes a certain amount of courage, and I'm willing to meet the challenge.
O my Father, Lord of light, beloved Majesty, my image, myself, we are one after all, you and I. Together we suffer, together exist, and forever we'll recreate each other. Recreate each other, suffer and recreate each other.
I think what is happening now, and has been happening subterraneanly all through these years that I have stuck to my guns about tonality in the face of rude criticism and vile epithets and all the rest, is that most of the composers are coming back to tonality. Almost all of them. They're coming around full circle because they want to communicate too. I see a tremendous coming together of all these disparate artists who have been at war with one another and with the public for so many years in not an effort, but in a very natural and almost predictable movement toward reaching communicatively a large public. And I think we are about to see a beautiful historic period in all the arts.